Support for this podcast is provided by the Florence County Museum, presenting Legend Francis Marion in the Pee Dee. The exhibit explores how 19th century art depicting Marion and his militia contributed to the Swamp Fox's legend in early American independence. Now on exhibit, flocomuseum.org.
From South Carolina Public Radio, this is Walter Edgar's Journal. I'm Walter Edgar, and I'd like to welcome you to our podcast series about South Carolina culture and history with a nod to all things Southern. Today, Alfred Turner and I will talk with Ben Zeigler and Stephen Motte from the Florence County Museum about the legend of Francis Marion.
The current exhibit at the museum, Legend Francis Marion in the Pee Dee, examines the early decades of American independence, when poets and painters turned General Francis Marion into a mythical figure, part fact, part folk legend. Their efforts were so effective that the cultural impact of their words and images lingers today.
Using historical artworks on loan from major national art institutions, along with new archaeological discoveries, Legend explores the truths and the myth of General Francis Marion in conjunction with South Carolina's recognition of the 250th anniversary of the Revolutionary War. With me in the studio today are Ben Zeigler, who is former chairman of the Francis Marion Trail Commission and also president of the Florence County Historical Society, and Stephen Motte, who is curator of interpretation and collections at the Florence County Museum. And we'll be talking about a wonderful exhibit at that museum featuring Francis Marion, one of the great heroes in American history and certainly the American Revolution. In the interest of full disclosure, we need to let our listeners know that the Florence County Museum is an underwriter of South Carolina Public Radio. So, gentlemen, welcome to the Journal.
Thank you, Walter. It's a pleasure.
Ben, before we went on mic, you were talking about the revival of interest in Francis Marion at the turn of the 21st century. Even in South Carolina, he'd kind of been forgotten.
Yeah, I mentioned that a mutual friend of ours, the late Bill Chandler, and I, Bill lived in Williamsburg County, and I live in Florence County. We were both sort of Francis Marion devotees, students of local history, and of course Francis Marion looms large in the Pee Dee. And Bill and I realized in 2005 that we were coming up on the 225th anniversary of Marion taking command of the Williamsburg militia at a place called Witherspoon's Ferry, which is in Lower Florence County. So Bill and I put on an event to celebrate that. As we began thinking about this and talking to other people interested in history and interested in preservation and culture, we realized the Marion story is there. Everyone knows it generally, but we didn't know a great deal about the specifics of it, the actual sites of battles, sites of camps, the material culture, what we could learn through archaeology. And also we realized, and this was at a time when the state was doing a good deal of tourism development research. We worked with the state tourism plan folks who came to South Carolina from Ireland, that the Marion story was a wonderful opportunity to bring people into the rural areas of the Pee Dee. If we could find these sites and develop them and interpret them, we could create what the tourism people call product that could bring people into Williamsburg County and Lower Florence County and Berkeley County and places like that. So it had several different thrusts, but the sort of overarching theme was a curiosity to dig deeper into the Marion story, to understand the real history, to understand the reasons behind the myth of Marion, the concept of Marion that has arisen over the last 200 years.
Well, of course, there are myths and there's history, and sometimes in the case of Marion, they might come together. Of course, Marion was one of the great heroes of the American Revolution. I've told people time and time again, if you look at the literature that came out in the early 19th century as America was developing a national culture, there are two men that are the subject of hagiographies,
right.
poetry, and you've got George Washington and you've got Francis Marion.
Yeah.
I mean, even in New England, William Cullen Bryant, one of the great New England poets, wrote the Song of Marion's Men.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right, Walter, and it's fascinating history, the development of the idea of Marion after the war. Marion died in 1795, so he didn't live very long into the early history of the Republic. But he, at the time of his death, it's very interesting to go back and read the contemporaneous accounts of Marion, the memoirs of people like Bannister Tarleton, who is his great nemesis, who never mentions Marion in his memoirs. Marion was a revered figure locally. He was seen as an important figure in the partisan war in South Carolina, but he didn't have the stature of a Washington or a Greene. And as you know, the man who changed that was Mason Locke Weems, who wrote or took a biography of Marion that had been written by Peter Ory, Marion's great friend and lieutenant. Ory had given it to Weems to publish. Weems then took it, rewrote it, and as Ory said, "'Tis not my history, but your romance." He turned it into a great sort of thematic piece from which you can sieve some real history, but Weems called him the Washington of the South.
Well, in terms of military, but also remember Parson Weems, as he was known, also wrote The Life of Washington.
Exactly.
The cherry tree fable and all of that. But obviously, both of those books caught the imagination of the American public and the American Republic in the days of the early 19th century.
Our mutual friend Steve Smith, who wrote the wonderful book about Marion, Myth, History, and Archaeology about the Snows Island community, which I commend to anyone interested in the subject, he says that when Southerners, South Carolinians in particular, moved west in the first quarter of the 19th century, and you know that whole story very well, that most of them took two books with them, the Bible and Weems's Life of Marion. And one of the things I find interesting, and it comes into the art to some extent, is that the people who fought with Marion, these were mostly sort of frontier people, very simple militia folks. And it wasn't until their children and grandchildren started getting rich on cotton in the first quarter of the 19th century that the Marion story exploded. And I truly believe that Marion provided these people sort of a myth of origin. My daddy fought with Francis Marion. My granddaddy fought with Francis Marion. But there was a certain part of the Marion theme that also tied into Southern identity that really reaches its peak in the 1850s.
And as you follow the movement of the South Carolinians west, their Marion counties, their towns named Marion, Alabama. I mean, in the old Southwest.
And Ohio and Indiana and just throughout the West.
Okay. Now, Stephen, one of the myths of Marion is, what did he look like? In your exhibit, you've got two portraits of Francis Marion, but there is no contemporary portrait of Francis Marion that exists.
Yeah, so one of the things that I wanted to address in this exhibition, which is largely about how the greater myth of Francis Marion was created and then disseminated and perpetuated really for the past 200 years, was how did America want its heroes to look? We don't have many reliable accounts of Marion's appearance. The most reliable one is the one that was published in 1821 by a former officer of Marion's named William Dobian James, who gives a very unflattering account of Marion, calling him, he was short, he was old, he was unattractive, he wasn't necessarily pleasant in demeanor. So you have this account written by someone who knew Marion, who served with Marion. But the problem is that as true as it may be, it's not very flattering. Mm. And so when people are trying to come up with how to visually represent this new emerging American identity, they're leaning on these major military figures like George Washington and others in these grandiose portraits.
Heroic figures.
These heroic figures, but Marion didn't necessarily fit the visual expectation.
And one thing you left out is that he was swarthy. He was a Huguenot.
Short, swarthy, bow-legged, hook-nosed.
Yeah.
We were laughing on the way over here. There's a wonderful line from Light Horse Harry Lee's memoir that was published in the first decade of the 19th century. And of course, Lee and Marion were a team from April 1781 through the rest of that year. Places like Fort Motte, Fort Watson, and they were a great pair. But Lee says in his memoir about Marion, quote, his visage was not pleasing and his manners were not captivating. So he was neither good-looking nor charming.
So there are two portraits in the exhibition. both painted in 1884, which was at the much later end of Marion's peak in popular culture after the Revolution. One painting was created by a German immigrant artist named Johann Stahl from Charleston. The other painted by a man named George Burnap, who was, at the time the portrait was painted, the president of the Carolina Art Association, which is now attached to the Gibbs Museum of Art. Both of these portraits, although they were painted at the same time and in the same place, depict Marion in different ways. If you look at the Johann Stahl portrait, Marion is presented in a very formal way. It's a three-quarter portrait. He's looking off to the side. He's wearing very formal military dress and cap. And he looks like a stoic American hero, the kind of hero that you would expect to see.
And this is sort of post-Civil War, very formal. We're back in a context of big armies and big events and big battles, which it's interesting when you look at the antebellum Marion representations, Crossing the Pee Dee, Sweet Potatoes, Birch's Mill. They show Marion, for the most part, during his partisan campaigns, when he's dressed very informally, he's dressed like a militiaman. I think that was very much part of the theme that was emerging of Marion being different and the story of Marion being different. I think Stephen and I were talking on the way over here that, Weems was all about creating a new national identity, creating themes around the infant American Republic. And no sooner does Weems bring Marion into that as the Southern component, then the fissures start to develop. I think Southerners, as we move into the 19th century, as we move through nullification in the 1830s and move toward the Civil War, that we see the South wanting to distinguish itself from the rest of the country in terms of its history and heritage. So you have great leaders like Washington and their tailor-made for epaulets and big battles and heroic paintings like crossing the Delaware or some of those great battles in the Northeast. And then you have Marion, who's always displayed in a very understated way. His men are shabby. It's, I think, very much part of creating this sense of Southern separateness in terms of our heritage.
Enter William Gilmore Simms.
Who,
through his novels, but he also wrote A Life of Marion.
And I brought a copy today. And, of course, Simms is interesting because we have Weems in 1809, and it's almost laughable when you read it. Peter Ory was furious at Weems. He did not have his permission. Weems did not get his permission.
I think one critic said Ory's manuscript was mangled.
Mangled, indeed. Unfortunately, we don't have Ory's manuscript, but we have at the Caroliniana Library Ory's copy of Weems, and there's a wonderful part, Steve Smith talks about this in his book, where Marion is given a speech before a battle or a skirmish, and he tells his men, "I have a sweetheart, and her name is Liberty." And in the margin, Ory writes, "Marion never made a speech to his men, ever." So he turns Marion into this sort of charismatic figure. He clearly had some sort of personal charisma. He was able to keep a group of militiamen together through the darkest part of the war. But Weems wanted to turn him into a sort of conventional late 18th, early 19th century hero. Then you have William W. James, who was a boy. His father was the great John James, who was Marion's chief lieutenant, at least one of his chief lieutenants. William W. James was a boy in Marion's brigade, and he wrote a reminiscence in 1821. William W. James, unfortunately, was an alcoholic. I think he lost his seat in the judiciary due to excessive drinking. He was writing it 40 years post. So there's some things in James that aren't quite right. Then Simms comes along. And, of course, by the time Simms publishes his biography in 1844, the Marion story is really on its own trajectory. The Francis Marion and the Sweet Potatoes has been painted the decade before.
Okay. All right, that's an excellent segue into back to you, Stephen, and talk about the paintings that you have on exhibition. Probably the most famous, well, there are two. One is Crossing the Pee Dee. The other is the Sweet Potato story. Which one?
And I'm curious because he didn't grow sweet potatoes. So tell us what this is about.
Well, so when we track the appearance of Marion's representation in 19th century art, the first significant American painting showing Marion in a story that was originally told by Weems, it appears in 1836, painted by John Blake White. right, who was like Marion from St. John's, Berkeley Parish, and who knew Marion, or at least knew Marion's family because they had adjacent plantations. The stories that were told by Weems and then later by James and by Sims, they get picked up by these artists who were, for their own purposes, trying to create visually that American identity. Right? So the story of Marion and the sweet potato dinner essentially is that Marion is in his famous swamp encampment at Snow's Island. He brings in a British officer blindfolded into his camp in order to discuss a prisoner exchange. And so in a show of his propriety, he invites this officer to share this very Spartan meal of sweet potatoes. So in John Blake White's interpretation of this popular story, we can see Marion sort of as a central figure. We can see the British officer wearing his red coat. We can see Marion's slave, Oscar Marion, on the ground, getting the sweet potatoes out of the fire and placing them on a table, a makeshift table. All this is surrounded by this Pee Dee swamp environment. And just to underscore that this exhibition at the Florence County Museum is titled Legend Francis Marion in the Pee Dee. And so what we're doing is we're linking 19th century art to the legend of Marion, specifically in the Pee Dee.
And so the end of the story is that the British officer is so impressed that these men are fighting so fiercely and living in the swamp and eating nothing but sweet potatoes and drinking water that he goes back to Georgetown and resigns his commission. He says, you can't fight men like that. Now, there are a couple of interesting connections with that. Number one, it's a remarkable painting in that it's a very formal sort of tableau. You see Marion and the officer standing in front of a table. It's almost got a Eucharistic feel to it. Marion's pointing at the potatoes like a priest would hold up the host. And I think this would have resonated with a educated 19th century audience. This painting became famous because it got disseminated, Stephen, by the American Art.
Yeah, the American Art Union, or as it was known at the time, the Apollo Association.
In 1840. And Walter, I think you'll remember you were at my parents' house once and we were looking at their print, and you said something about how Marion didn't look like that. He was ugly, and my mother told you that you were not a proper historian if you thought Francis Marion was ugly. But he looks like a matinee idol. He's very youthful. He's very almost sort of Tom Cruise-like. But it's got this sort of sacral feeling. And the people who would have had that print in their house between 1840 and 1860, if they were educated, they would have been educated in Latin and Greek. And they probably would have read the Greek author Plutarch. And Plutarch has a number of instances where he talks about the Spartans in ancient Greece. When they were on campaign, they lived on something called the black broth, milos zomos in ancient Greek. And it's this awful pottage made out of pig's blood and vinegar and offal. And there are a number of instances in Plutarch where people say, no wonder the Spartans fight so fiercely. If they're brave enough to live on the black broth and eat that awful food, they're clearly not scared of death. So there's this sense that, what they're eating somehow reflects who they are.
They're eating something common, earthy.
Mainly, slaves were fed on sweet potatoes. They were easily grown. You could throw them in a sack. You could transport them.
Okay. We've got the painting, but then, Stephen, weren't prints developed, and so this image was scattered across the country?
Yeah, so John Blake White creates the painting in 1836, along with some other paintings of Marion, right, and his Revolutionary War activities. One of the important things about this painting is it was the first, right? It was the first significant appearance of Marion in an American painting. Second is that if you take a look at Marion in this painting, he looks nothing like William James' description. And although John Blake White knew Marion and Marion's family, he has made a decision to represent him in this way. 4 years after this painting is finished, The Apollo Association in New York, they produce an engraving, right, that is printed by the thousands and then distributed to their membership. So not everyone can come to see the original painting, but you produce this print, it gets sent out to thousands of people. And so this image of Marion is one of the first that gets imprinted in people's minds so that when they think of him in this way and in this scene.
All right. Now, was the print in color or was it black and white?
Both.
Both.
And they would have been hand-colored.
Yeah. And so the sweet potato story survived the denigration of the South in history after the American Civil War. And Marion himself pretty well survived in terms of history. But that sweet potato story, reaching out to your enemy, sharing what you have. And as you said, the Spartan image would have resonated with a lot of folks.
Well,
too.
the irony of it is we never have found Marion's camp on Snows Island, but we did, during the Francis Marion Trail Commission work, find Marion's redoubt, or we were able to confirm that an earthwork on the other side of the river was Marion's redoubt at a place called Dunham's Bluff, and we found a camp. So it's a pretty high degree of certainty that it's Marion's camp. And in that camp were middens, rubbish pits, and in those rubbish pits we found cow bones, pig bones, deer bones, fish bones, oyster shells. So not only were they not just eating sweet potatoes, they were living pretty high, even eating oysters when they were camped there at Dunham's Bluff across from Snows Island, which not a huge surprise. 30 miles upstream from 30 miles upstream from Georgetown. Oysters are easily transportable in the cold months. You can throw them on a barge or throw them over the back of your saddle.
Well, you've also got, these are country boys. They know how to survive.
Well, no one in the Pee Dee who knows our landscape and knows our environment would have believed for a minute that a bunch of boys like that would be camped in the swamp between August and March of 1780, 1781, and all they would have to eat is sweet potatoes. Pee Dee Swamp is full of fish and game, and these guys knew how to get it. So it's a great story, but almost certainly apocryphal.
I have a question.
Yes.
So we have now at last, with this painting becoming a print and becoming widely distributed, we've got a stamp of it, this image of Francis Marion, but no contemporary image.
Nope.
In the same way, we have stories of Francis Marion, first with Weems and then with Sims, coming out. So Weems is more of a hagiography, and Sims is maybe promoting some things that were simply stories, not based in anything that anybody contemporary wrote down or said. Are there any Francis Marion papers?
There are. His orderly book, his letters to Nathaniel Greene, people like Steve Smith have really combed through those to pick up as much information as they can. But these are pretty, sort of formal communications. They don't give any sort of subjective insights. They're descriptions of troop conditions and need for supplies and that sort of thing. Another interesting thing is some of the few contemporary accounts we have of Marion, or accounts from his contemporaries, come from pension applications from the 1820s and 1830s, old men who had fought with Marion, who were trying to get a pension from the government for their service. And Steve Smith does a great job of fleshing this out in his book, that what we find is these pension applications will describe something. There's several that say, I was the man who was cooking the sweet potatoes, for instance. Well, what you find in this person's pension application is that their description of what they did is lifted straight out of Weems. So the story of Francis Marion was sort of collapsing on itself because it was giving rise to literature that then people were turning into fact. And so it's very hard to pick through those and find what someone actually remembered. And it's a great study on the relationship of memory to history.
One of the things that was not a myth was the heterogeneous nature of Marion's men. Persons who were enslaved, persons who were free.
Some black, some white is what Gates's adjutant said. 20 men and boys, some black, some white, all miserably equipped is the way.
Yes, and Gates, Galloper, Granny Gates,
sent him away.
Didn't have much use for Francis Marion. He depended upon Thomas Sumter and got himself beat.
That's very true. He sent Marion off to quote unquote gather intelligence to this obscure corner of the state that we now call the Pee Dee, thinking that Marion was out of the way. So I think it's one of the great stories in the American Revolution. Marion rides out of Gates's camp probably the afternoon of August 15th. We know from Peter Ory's journal that they were awakened the next morning. They'd gotten 10 miles down the road toward Williamsburg. They were awakened by the sound of gunfire, and they knew that the great battle that everyone had been waiting for started, and they had a question: do we go back and fight, or do we keep going? Marion said, no, we keep going. So they keep going. They ride into Witherspoon's Ferry on probably the afternoon of August 17th, and they don't know it, but they're the only fighting force left. Sumter's been defeated. Gates has been defeated. Marion's it. And for a good part of the remainder of 1780 and into 1781, he is it. That's the only thing.
Well, he is in the Low Country. But
in the Low Country, yeah. Sumter gets back on his feet.
Well, but we're not really depending upon Sumter in the Up Country.
Right.
I mean, you've got all sorts of smaller militia groups, particularly beginning with Huck's defeat.
Huck's defeat, yeah.
And there's a whole string of these partisan raids.
I've read your book on that.
Yeah.
What's interesting for me is that when you take a look at the significant American artworks from the 19th century, these artists have nearly unanimously decided to portray Marion in the Pee Dee. So although he was certainly active and well known for his other military campaigns, it was his activities in the Pee Dee that became the subject of these famous stories that were told by his biographers and that were then later picked up by American artists.
And that's the partisan phase. That's the romantic phase. Marion's on Snow's Island. It's like his Athelney. It's his secret hideout from which he sallies forth from the mysterious depths of the swamp. That's that partisan phase. And so I think that's what's important to Southerners leading up to the Civil War. And Steve, again, I hate to keep citing Steve's book, but it is so excellent. He talks about all the nullifiers and secessionists who invoked Marion. They're trying to come and change us. They're trying to come and change our way of life. Remember the spirit of Marion. Resist the powers of the federal government. So Marion really becomes sort of a lightning rod in the 1840s and 1850s for folks. He represents that independence.
But he still is a national hero. That's one of the ironies.
It is. He means different things to different people, I think.
Well, let's move to the second major. It's not a myth. He did cross the Pee Dee.
Sure, yeah.
And that's an incredible portrait. And I think in terms of art, Stephen, let's place it in national perspective.
So the largest painting in the exhibition, and possibly the largest historical painting of Francis Marion created in the 19th century, was painted in 1850 by an artist named William Ranney. Now, William Ranney was born in Connecticut, but spent about 7 years living in North Carolina at what we would call the Yadkin end of the Great Pee Dee. And William Ranney was very concerned with painting genre scenes, the everyday man, just the everyday lives of people. And then later, as he became interested in subject matter of the American West, the American frontier. But in the Southeast, Ranney was very interested in the Great Pee Dee River. So it appears in a couple of his paintings. One is a simple genre scene of some people on a ferry crossing the Pee Dee, and that predates this painting, Marion crossing the Pee Dee, which is about 7 feet wide. It's in this very ornate gold frame. It is on loan to the exhibition from the Ammon Carter Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. It's an interesting painting for a couple of reasons. We have a large group of men all packed together on this flat raft like a ferry going across the Great Pee Dee River. It looks like it's dusk, right? You can see the river receding off into the horizon. So it's dark. You can imagine that Francis Marion is sort of moving quietly, secretively across the river. But Marion doesn't appear in the center or the foreground of this image. He appears off to the side and he's behind some other figures. So Ranney has decided to present Marion in the midst of his men, his militia, this irregular army that were devoted to him, devoted to the cause. So as much as Marion is the subject matter, he is not in the center of the painting.
It looks like I think one critic has said it looks like a party coming back from a deer drive. They're deer dogs. They're, sort of guys in buckskin with powder horns. And, they look like pretty sort of organic group of people. This isn't, you'd like to compare it to Washington crossing the Delaware, where you've got Washington, this great figure, and it's resplendent in his uniform and the flag. And it really makes almost a sort of ideological argument about the movement of the American Revolution and liberty and the American cause in the war. And this is so different and so much more understated, and I've been sort of grappling with the right way to think about the distinction between the two, but I really think that the theme that comes out of these artworks, it's more of a defense of home. It's more of a sort of, this is who we are, this is where we are, we're defending our home. Crossing the Delaware, it wants to make a point. It wants to get you into an argument about some of the underlying ideologies in the war. And I'm a firm believer that was always dangerous to do in the antebellum South, because when you started talking about things like freedom and liberty and civil rights and all the ideological underpinnings of the revolution, you bumped up against slavery, and that became difficult. So there's more of a sense in these Marion paintings that these are sort of people of the land defending their land, which I think is the way Southerners were beginning to speak in those first decades of the 19th century.
Well, this is another one of those paintings that was engraved and widely distributed, right, Stephen?
This became one of the most well-known images of Marion, telling that Marion story. It was distributed in prints by the American Art Union, which is what became of the Apollo Association in New York, who owned the painting for a time. And so the Marion story gets distributed in the same way that the Sweet Potato Dinner painting by John Blake White gets distributed. Not everyone can come to see the original painting, but by distributing the image, you can distribute the story and therefore the myth.
But I will say, if you can, come and see it at the Florence County Museum. It is spectacular. I get a chill when I walk in front of it. It just really glows.
Is this an exhibit that's going to be permanently there, or?
No, this exhibition is up until the middle of August.
You want to talk about the other Sweet Potatoes painting? Because I think that was almost sort of a launching point.
Yes.
Well, I would say, before we move on to that if you take a look at John Blake White's painting of, Marion and the Sweet Potato Dinner, although he has chosen to depict Marion as a young man in this heroic fashion, it's not that he was unaware of what Marion looked like. If you take a look at other paintings by John Blake White of Marion, for instance, the burning of the Motte mansion, you can see that John Blake White has depicted Marion as an older man. He was certainly aware of what Marion looked like. And the other thing to note about John Blake White's paintings is that John Blake White was also a playwright. And so these paintings, when you look at the way that they're composed much like someone in theater.
It's a tableau.
Would compose a scene. You've got a few central characters in the foreground. They're dramatically composed and theatrically lit. It's just something interesting to me about John Blake White as an artist and his treatment of the subject matter.
So they're in the proscenium, so to speak. I mean, they're as if on the stage in front of you.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, there is another painting that White did of inviting a British officer to share his meal, in which there is an older man. He's got the beaked nose.
Oh, that's not White. We don't know who that is.
That's not White?
That's not White. That's part of the mystery.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the Oakland Club painting, it's fascinating. The Oakland Club is one of the oldest hunting clubs in South Carolina and actually owns much of the Marion family's lands down on the Santee River. And I'm a member of the Oakland Club, but have been there for years as a guest. And the first time I was there as a guest, I walked into the parlor of the main house, and there was this painting that just startled me. And it was this representation. I knew what it was immediately, but it was so different from the John Blake White version of Sweet Potatoes. The first thing I noticed, Walter, as we discussed, is Marion looks like he's supposed to. He's short, bow-legged, hook-nosed, swarthy. He's even wearing the kind of clothes that William W. and James said.
Too bad your mother couldn't see that.
My mother wouldn't have approved of it, but anyway. But there's no table, there's no tableau. The sweet potatoes are arrayed on a log, and of the sweet potato stories, and Steve Smith's got a great discussion of those in his book, the different stories and where they come from. Weems has them on a log. So this is probably Weemsian. And I took Stephen down there a couple of years ago to look at the painting, took it out of the frame and looked at the stretcher and everything. And Stephen, I think, has some ideas on its age. It may predate John Blake White.
Well,
but one of the key things is the swamp itself is the painting. It's not the sweet potatoes, but it's this whole sort of atmosphere of Marion's camp.
the first thing that caught my eye, just behind Marion, there's a snake.
Yeah, there's a dead snake in the background. And, of course, the characters are absolutely creepy, like something out of a horror movie. So,
Yeah.
Well, so what's also interesting to note in this painting, the subject matter is the same as in John Blake White's painting of Marion inviting a British officer to share his meal, but the treatment is a little bit different. As Ben said, the environment is almost the subject matter here, whereas the figures who are engaged in the action, they appear sort of to the left and to the right of the image. But what you do get is this depiction of the swamps around the great Pee Dee River, where this supposedly took place.
To me, the swamp is the story. I hate to do this, gentlemen, but Alfred is giving me the wind-up sign.
Okay. Yep.
And so, any last words for our listeners before we sign off today?
Well, I had brought one quote with me that I would like to read, if you don't mind, because I think this exhibit not only has incredible art, but it's a real interesting study on history, how art and history interact. And I think Sims, I've gained a new appreciation for Sims in getting ready for all this. I think Sims, as much as anyone in the 19th century, got it. And there's a great quote in the first part of Sims that I'd like to read, if you don't mind.
Sure.
He writes, "The fame of Marion rests very much upon tradition. There is little in the books to justify the strong and exciting relish with which the name is spoken and remembered throughout the country. In this respect, his reputation is like that of all other heroes of romantic history. It is a people's history, written in their hearts rather than in their books, which their books could not write, which would lose all of its golden glow if subjected to the cold details of phlegmatic chronicles." So I think that captures, he got it. He understood that the Marion he was dealing with was more of a mythological figure than a historical figure.
Stephen?
Well, also kind of point to the origin of this is in literature. The origin of these artworks is in the stories that were told by Mason Locke Weems and by William James and William Gilmore Simms. And, to keep in mind the fact that we may think that we know all there is to know about Marion. But as this archaeology has recently revealed, we don't know everything there is to know. And much of what we thought we knew comes from the history of art and the way that Marion was treated by 19th century artists.
Well, Stephen Motte and Ben Zeigler, I want to thank you both for being with us today on The Journal. I hope you enjoyed today's journal. I know that I did. When I first broached the topic of let's talk about an art exhibit, to tell this story on a podcast, some of my friends thought wouldn't be possible, but it was. The interplay of literature, art, history, and archaeology are all a part of the story of this exhibit at the Florence County Museum, and describing it on the radio with two folks who are so enthusiastic about the life and legend of Francis Marion brought this part of South Carolina and American history to a wider audience.
Walter Edgar's Journal is a production of South Carolina Public Radio. I'm Alfred Turner, and I produce the show, which is made possible by listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. Remember, the views and opinions expressed on Walter Edgar's Journal are not necessarily those of South Carolina Public Radio or its underwriters.
New episodes of Walter Edgar's Journal are published on the first and third Fridays of the month and are available at southcarolinapublicradio.org or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. We'll talk again soon.